What is up, ladies and gents? This is George Bean, and today is my review for the 2011 Marvel superhero film, Captain America, the First Avenger, which was the first chapter in the Captain America trilogy, and the fifth overall in the still-growing Marvel Cinematic Universe. The film was directed by Joe Johnston and written by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, and was produced by hotshot Marvel Studios CEO Kevin Feige, who I'm sure by this point in time is swimming in a big pool full of money from these movies, and starring Chris Evans as the titular superhero Captain America. When released to theaters on the 22nd of July 2011, the film was a commercial success, grossing over $370 million worldwide, and had received positive receptions, with appraisal towards the 1940s time period and Johnston's direction. Although some did feel the film did not serve any other purpose than to set up the forthcoming Avengers team-up film. The plot: it is the early 1940s, the time when Europe was in the middle of being ravaged by the Second World War between the Allies, led by Britain and America, and the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany. After being rejected for recruitment into the U.S. Army, a frail, sickly man named Steve Rogers is then recruited for a U.S. super soldier experiment, through which he becomes the American mascot known as Captain America. After finally proving his ability in combat, Rogers becomes the one person standing between the free world and a rogue Nazi scientist known as the Red Skull and his terrorist organization, Hydra. Development on a Captain America film began as far back as 1997, but it wasn't until 2005 when Marvel Comics had received a $525 million investment from Merrill Lynch, allowing them to independently produce 10 films from their slate of comics. This huge loan would effectively launch the Marvel Cinematic Universe we now know as today, which paid off very well now 10 years later. Captain America was included as part of the 10 planned films, with the initial plans being that it was to stand alone and that, according to Kevin Feige, about half the movie would be set during World War II before moving into the modern day, with producer Avi Arad, the guy who produced Spider-Man and ran it into the ground twice already, pointing out the contrast between the 1940s and 21st century American ideologies as an intriguing concept to explore, and he had also cited the Back to the Future trilogy as an influence, which is a nice little touch to influence. These are my favorite time travel movies. In 2008, Joe Johnston signed on to direct the film. Feige had cited Johnston's directorial work on The Rocketeer and his special effects work on the original Star Wars trilogy to explain why he was an appropriate choice to direct the film. In addition, Raiders of the Lost Ark was a huge influence on the film as well, because they hoped the film would not feel like a period piece. Of course, during the film's development, some people expressed concern of anti-US sentiments possibly affecting the film's box office, mainly due to the fact that its superhero is called Captain America. But Feige seemed unfazed by this, arguing that the political climate and changing zeitgeist as a result of the election of US President Barack Obama was a good thing for the movie. I remember one time when this movie was being prepped that they were thinking of calling it the First Avenger Captain America. I presumed because they feared of spurring a shitstorm over a movie that has America in the title, but they eventually settled on calling it just the other way around, Captain America the First Avenger. And I'm glad they stuck with that, because since then, in the sequels, the title is shown prominently in big letters. In the sequels, we have Captain America the Winter Soldier and Captain America Civil War. This was Chris Evans' first outing as Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, but it was not the first Marvel superhero he had ever played, having played the Human Torch in the 2005 Fantastic Four film and its sequel in 2007. Of course, years before, and the Human Torch is more of a street-smart wise-ass, while Steve Rogers was more of a kind-hearted patriot who wants to do the right thing. And I believe that Evans will be remembered more as Captain America than he was as the Human Torch, in my opinion. What makes Cap great as a superhero is that he is not some very special super guy with an attitude. He's just a simple Boston kid with heart and simply wants to do the right thing for the world. He doesn't have any ulterior plans. He's just tunnel visioned and straight-laced with doing the right thing on how he feels. He's a superhero with a heart. Superman! And another thing I'm also happy with is that even though Captain America is superhuman, he can still bleed. So whenever he possibly gets shot straight on, he gets injured from the gunshot and even bleeds. He's not like Wolverine, who can heal up from a severe wound in an instant. So I'm glad they've kept with that bit. He may be superhuman, but he's still vulnerable to being wounded. It's the reason why I go more for heroes like John McClane and Batman. They're human because they are human beings that can bleed. Not like Steven Seagal, who thinks he's superhuman and is not featured being injured once in his movies. Next is Hugo Weaving as Johann Schmidt, aka the Red Skull, a Nazi scientist and leader of the Hydra organization. Of course, we'd all know Weaving more as Agent Smith in the Matrix movies or in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But he was also pretty good as the Red Skull here, despite only appearing in one movie here. But as always, he's some megalomaniacal guy who bravely desires world domination by harnessing the power of the Tesseract. Now, one thing I learned, spoilers, in Avengers 3, the Red Skull appears in that film, but he's not played by Hugo Weaving because Hugo Weaving was hesitant in returning in the role. He's played by a different actor. And then we have Haley Atwell as Peggy Carter, an officer of the Strategic Scientific Reserve and Rogers' love interest. I like how Carter is portrayed in this film. She's shown to be strong-willed and able to hold her own in a dangerous situation and not just some damsel in distress. And her building relationship with Rogers, I think, is done very well, I believe. She doesn't instantly fall for him instantly. It's very platonic. I compare it to the Indy-Marion relationship in Raiders, in a way. And so when they finally kiss, it feels like it's earned, and their relationship also holds a very big impact on Steve when he ends up waking up in modern times emotionally. We also have Dominic Cooper as Howard Stark, Tony Stark's father, who worked on government projects for the U.S. Army dating back to the World War II era. I will say, it was good of them to include Tony Stark's father in this film. We get to see how much Howard is like his son, that genius billionaire playboy philanthropist persona, and it also sets up how his friendship with Captain America ends up having a somewhat negative impact on Tony, as Tony is shown to resent Cap because Howard kept bringing up how awesome Cap was in World War II. But yeah. We do get more Dominic Cooper as Stark in the Agent Carter show, but I wish they'd bring him back in the movies. Maybe a movie set in the early Cold War years. And next up we have Tommy Lee Jones as Colonel Chester Phillips, military leader of the U.S. Army and Rogers' commanding officer. TLJ plays the role as a Colonel Patton type in this film, but it's always good to see Jones in whatever movie he's in, even when he's playing an authority man. And then there's also Stanley Tucci as Dr. Abraham Erskine, the German scientist who created the super soldier serum that is used for Rogers. Stanley Tucci is really good in this film. He plays the German scientist in a sympathetic light, as it is shown that Erskine had worked for the Red Skull but defected to the US, much like what actually happened in World War II when the German and Jewish scientists had defected to the US to escape prosecution from the Nazis. And finally, we have Sebastian Stan as Bucky Barnes, a U.S. Army sergeant and Steve's best friend. While not much to say about Stan as Bucky in this film, but it does set up his friendship with Captain America in the overall MCU, and it also perfectly sets up his role in the sequel, The Winter Soldier. So it is very important to know who Bucky is by watching this movie first. But I'd say come the sequel, Sebastian Stan becomes outstandingly stellar as Bucky. I'd say Bucky has the best character development in the Captain America trilogy, and you'll see why when we get around to Winter Soldier and Civil War. The music was composed by Alan Silvestri, of who I am also a fan of thanks to his musical work on such films as Back to the Future. I love his score for James Cameron's The Abyss, which I want to say, The Abyss is possibly my favorite Jim Cameron film ever, and I do want to review that movie in the future. So yeah, my reviews for The Abyss, it's gonna come at a computer near you. But yeah, Alan Silvestri, I even enjoyed his main theme score for Marvel's The Avengers. I was saddened that he did not return for Avengers 2, Age of Ultron, but I am glad to hear that he has returned for Avengers 3, Infinity War, and its direct sequel, Avengers 4. In this film, I do like how he goes for a sort of patriotic theme in the score, given that the film is set in the 1940s. It almost sounds like if you take John Williams' scores for Superman and Indiana Jones, and you mash them together, and you get this score. That's how it sounds like to me. To say, when I first watched this movie on DVD, I haven't had the chance to see it in cinema, but when I first watched it on DVD, I really enjoyed it. I loved it mainly for its World War II setting. It was such a nice, refreshing setting for a superhero movie. It felt more like a movie about the US Army. And yes, this movie really does remind me of Raiders. And in a good way. Both movies revolve around Nazis seeking to acquire an ancient artifact which could possibly give them unlimited power for world domination, and the heroes' fierce attempts to stop them from acquiring that power, stuff like that. I mean, yeah, I really do have a soft spot for this movie, for its 1940s World War II setting. I'm really glad that they stuck to their guns and chose to set the entire film in that period, in that time, rather than doing it for half of the movie before shifting the setting to modern times, because that has already been done in that old Captain America movie from 1990. Half of that film was set in World War II before shifting to the modern world. And I'd say that movie did not completely flesh out Cap's origin and how he got into the suit in that film. Whereas in this film, his origin and the suit are all given enough breathing space to explore it in its entirety throughout the film, so I'm glad it does that, much like Batman Begins. My favorite little bit in this film had to be when Rogers infiltrates the first Hydra base to liberate the imprisoned army soldiers there and his friend Bucky. When the truck he's on arrives, a Hydra agent opens the curtain and finds Rogers' first shield with the American flag painted on it, and then Rogers rams the shield onto the agent, pushing him back very far. I love that bit. It's like a way of saying, "America, bitch! Symbolism!" And to say, the climax involves Rogers having to stop the Red Skull from driving this massive flying bomber craft, the Valkyrie, which Red Skull intends to use to drop weapons of mass destruction on Allied cities around the globe, including New York. What I like is that it's mentioned that the bomb's destructive power is actually harnessed by the Tesseract. They're not actual nuclear bombs. I mean, this is when the US was still attempting to build a nuclear bomb, the Manhattan Project. So the fact that they mentioned the Tesseract's power is harnessed into these bombs are a nice touch. But after defeating the Red Skull, who dissolves into another dimension after touching the Tesseract, a la Raider style. Steve tries to fly the bomber, but finds that he's unable to divert the flight path, so he decides to sacrifice himself by crashing the bomber into the Arctic ice. It sets up how he ends up being frozen in the ice for 70 years until he is found and awoken in modern times. With this film set entirely in World War II, the ending perfectly sets up his ending up in the 21st century, and the premise of Steve having to adapt to modern times is saved for the sequel, which, as we all know, was done very well in the sequel, The Winter Soldier. One of the best sequels ever. Oh, and also, the Tesseract I mentioned here. It's a powerful mystical artifact and an infinity stone, which the Red Skull and Hydra uses as a weapon to advance their weapons and their world domination goal. It's like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Nazis desire to use the Ark of the Covenant to make them into an invincible army. What I do love is how we are introduced to the Tesseract, because it sets it up to be used as a plot device for the Avengers film. So here we are given enough to know how powerful it is and how it could be used as a dreadful weapon. Contrast this to how the Mother Boxes were introduced in the Justice League movie. In that, we are never informed or introduced to the Mother Boxes in the DCEU until Justice League. So we just see the boxes in that movie as a MacGuffin in that film, making it fall victim to being compared to the Tesseract in this film. I just have to say it here, but I have gotten to watch the 1990 original Captain America movie, which was more of a low-budget B-movie produced by Menahem Golan and directed by Albert Pyun. Really, if you happen to watch the 1990 film, and then you immediately watch both the First Avenger and the Winter Soldier back-to-back, it kind of feels like the latter two are sort of like... It feels like that, these two movies are sort of like a two-part reimagining of the 1990 film. It's like they took that film's storyline and expanded it into two films. The first half is set in World War II and showing Steve Rogers' transformation into Captain America and his battle against the Red Skull before he ends up frozen in ice. And the second half is set half a century later with Cap awakening from the ice to a modern and completely different world than the one he left behind, and having to battle an old nemesis from his past. So yeah, these two movies are like a two-part remake of the 1990 original, except these movies did the Captain America mythos better. So yeah, overall, I believe that Captain America, the First Avenger, earns a rating of 7 stars out of 10. Because it is, in my honest opinion, one of the few good origin movies in the superhero genre, aside from Batman Begins, that's still the best one, but still. And it is also one of the few decent films in the MCU's Phase 1. The World War II setting is a nice and interesting setting for a superhero film. It explores Captain America's origin story perfectly well, and this having been Chris Evans' first movie as the titular hero, I'd say he did a pretty good job on his first outing, but he does get better by the time The Winter Soldier comes around, I promise you. So, thank you for watching, ladies and gents, and I will be reviewing The Winter Soldier and Civil War next. So, yeah, those will be coming up very soon. So thanks for watching, ladies and gents, and until then, I will see you all next time. Peace!